And that legalism is the infection which obstructs the final light from lighting the world. And the core doctrine is penal substitution theology. That's the core distortion. And it comes from the idea that God's law works like our law. Let me read you this quote from a guy named George Fifield. He was a theologian who wrote this in a book called God is Love in 1897. God created all things by Jesus Christ, and therefore Christ is the mighty God, the everlasting Father of intelligent beings, of all intelligent beings in the world. God the Father is the Father of Christ, and therefore through him of all these beings created by Christ. Now the All-Father gave to his children certain rules or laws to regulate their conduct. These laws were not arbitrary, not designed to show his right or power to boss or domineer over his children, but like the rules of a well-regulated family, they were designed to promote the happiness of all the children and the unity of the family life. Although many might hesitate to express it thus, the thought that lingers in their mind is about like this. How many of you might have, at some point in your journey, had this type of a thought? God is arbitrary and obstinate and will not permit the slightest variation from his laws without plunging us into eternal death. I've heard preachers give sermons on Uzzah, connected with the fruit in the garden. Just a little piece of fruit, just touch an ark, slightest deviation, and God struck them down. That's what this is saying. Fifield's saying this is the distortion of what people think. God has rules, and if you go against me, boom, you're dead. Continue on with Fifield. This is what Satan has ever said of God and his government. I desire to show the contrary so that all may see. I desire to show that it is the variation itself that plunges us into eternal death, and not the arbitrary decree of God. It is the love of God that will not in any way countenance that variation because it leads to such terrible results. The law of God is not simply his fiat, in other words, his spoken word. It rests upon eternal principles of pleasure and pain. Principles as unchangeable in their very nature as the laws that govern the seasons or control the motions of the planets. The law is not so simply because God said so, but he said so because it was so, and because it must eternally and universally be so. On the correct understanding of these principles of the nature of God's law depends our power to comprehend God's love in all his dealings with his creatures. On this rests the whole philosophy of the purpose of creation and the plan of redemption. The existence of misery and suffering, the need for the atonement, and how the atonement is accomplished by Christ can be understood in the light of God's love only as the nature of his law stands revealed. We have always thought of the Ten Commandments as requiring our love to God and to all his creatures. Have you ever thought of them as an expression of his love to us? It would be absolutely foolish to demand our love by arbitrary command. Love cannot be given in that way. Love is born only of love. The state might as well legislate that the sun should not shine or water should not flow downhill as for the Lord to make such an arbitrary demand for love. In either case, the law could not affect in the slightest the thing legislated about. Yet it remains true that all the law of God requires is love. And that the Apostle Paul says love is the fulfilling of the law, the whole law. How is this? Simply that the law itself, when we understand it, is the revelation of such infinite love as to beget within us a returning, responsive love that can and will fulfill the law. One more sentence or two. God is love. Every word, every jot, every tittle of that law coming from love requires only such service as love dictates. When the same love which the law expresses to us is begotten by it in our hearts and flows out towards God and all his creatures in loving action, then the law is fulfilled. Do you see? Fifield had this. Fifield saw the difference between imperial law and design law. That was over 100 years ago. We're still stuck. So the question from our lesson It's a conflict over God's law. I see the conflict, the core issue that you have to ground yourself in, and that is what type of law? Is it imposed or is it designed? And then you can begin answering the bigger questions. Once Christianity became infected with the lie that God's law functions like human law, then the Roman Church, and this is historic, you can read this in the encyclopedia, the Roman Church changed the commandments of God, deleting the commandment about images, splitting the 10th commandment in two, so we still have 10. People would have probably noticed, hey, wait a minute, these are the 9 commandments. What happened to the 10th? Okay, so when they deleted the one about images, they split the 10th in two, so we still have 10. And then they changed the Sabbath from Sunday to Saturday. That's right, from Saturday to Sunday, thank you. Sadly, many Christians have failed to see the real change, though. They focus on the actual evidence of the change. What's the evidence of the change? The deleting of the 2nd, the changing of the 4th. That's the evidence of the change. But that's not the real change. The real change is the change in the nature of the law itself, that you think God's law functions like human law, legislated, imposed rules. What church ever voted to change the law of gravity? Why don't they? They can't. So if a church does change God's law, it's evidence that they don't see it as design law. It's just a system of rules subject to be changed, like we can change our laws. Sadly, many have failed to see the real change and instead focus only on the evidence, and thus they stay stuck in loyalty to the false system. And so many who have reclaimed the seventh-day Sabbath are still infected with the lie that God's law functions like human law, imposed rules, and thus they worship a God, like Satan alleges, only on the right Bible day. And so they're like the Jews who want Christ off the cross to keep the day. With this in mind, I think we can now turn to the lesson and see how these days fit in the two systems of law.